Dear students, welcome to UGC EPG Pathshala on Human Rights and Duties. My name is Professor YSR Murthy. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights Studies, OP Jindal Global University. In the unit on national mechanisms for protection and enforcement of human rights, we take up today a critical evaluation of the National Human Rights Commission. In the earlier modules, we saw the Paris Principles, we also saw the Protection of Human Rights Act, and we have examined the structure, composition, powers of the National Human Rights Commission, and we also reviewed the activities of the Commission. Now, in this module, we are going to look at the achievements of the Commission as well as the lacuna of the Commission. It will be a kind of an assessment as to whether the Commission has fulfilled its role or not. When we evaluate a body like this, we really need to see what functions have been entrusted to the Commission. For instance, Section 12 of the Protection of Human Rights Act enumerates a list of items for which the Commission shall be responsible for, and we need to critically assess what the Commission has done under each of these objectives and what have been its achievements over the past 23 years or so, and where has it not really performed, and then take a balanced view as to whether it has really proved and whether it has really met public expectations. At the end of this module, all students will have an understanding of the challenges and limitations of the National Human Rights Commission in terms of its statutes and operations, and this module also seeks to provide the students with information relating to some of the achievements of the Commission over the years since its inception, and the students will also understand how far the NHRC complies with the Paris Principles and other guidelines. For as you all know, the Commission was established in the year 1993 under the Protection of Human Rights Act for better protection of these rights, and the Commission could not present itself as a panacea or a cure for all the human rights violations. And in fact, today some non-governmental organizations dub it as a toothless tiger, and it has been suffering from several weaknesses since its inception, and we will of course see in great detail what these infirmities are. Having said that, the Commission also has a number of achievements to its credits, and if it has to really establish itself, it needs to handle these challenges. First, let us take up what achievements have been done by the Commission. Let us first take up complaints handling. In the first year of the Commission, it received only 496 complaints, and these have been increasing by leaps and bounds, and of late it has been receiving over 1,00,000 of complaints every year, and the Commission has taken a number of measures to effectively handle this huge deluge of complaints through proper computerization, issue of practice direction, fast tracking of urgent or serious complaints, or appointment of special rapporteurs and special representatives, and Commission also resorted to specialized training, law reform. Now, as far as the law reform is concerned, the Commission since its inception has reviewed over 35 acts, drafts, bills, etc. These relate to terrorism. For instance, it has reviewed TADA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, etc. It has reviewed legislations relating to child rights, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, Criminal Procedure Code, Indian Penal Code, Police Act, the Prisons Act, and it has also reviewed the Protection of Human Rights Act itself, and it has made from time to time very important recommendations for law reform, and some of these reforms have led to some positive action. And when you take up review of international conventions, the Commission persuaded the government to sign the Torture Convention, 2 optional protocols to the Children's Convention. As a result of the Commission's efforts, the Government of India signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Commission in fact recommended a number of other international conventions to the Government of India for its consideration and review, and of course, some of these are still awaited, but as far as the review of international conventions are concerned, the National Human Rights Commission can take some pride in quite a few achievements. Of course, in the year 1997, as a result of the NHRC's persuasion, the Government of India signed the Torture Convention, but it is yet to ratify it, and the Commission has been maintaining consistent pressure on the government to ratify the UN Convention relating to torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. Now, let us take up what the Commission has done as far as spreading of human rights literacy and awareness. It has prepared source books on school education, it has prepared materials for teacher training, and NHRC has also prepared materials for development of courses in colleges along with the University and Grants Commission UGC. It has prepared courses on human rights for training of public servants, police officials and members of the armed forces. It has also encouraged and supported non-governmental organizations in their function of spreading awareness and literacy. And of course, unless one spreads information about the human rights awareness, it cannot be secured. Now, let us look at the NHRC's provisions with regard to violations committed by security forces. As far as violations committed by army is concerned, the Commission can at best ask for a report from the government and it cannot investigate. So, this lack of jurisdiction over violations committed by armed forces hampers the effectiveness of the Commission, especially when armed forces are responsible for few violations of human rights. The lack of plurality in the Commission is also a cause for concern. For instance, the composition of the NHRC at present does not reflect the plurality that is required under the Paris Principles. There is no adequate representation of the women, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, minorities, persons with disabilities and other vulnerable sections of the society. For instance, why is this plurality important? When the composition of the Commission plural in nature, it enables civil society, it enables people from these vulnerable sections of the society to identify it themselves with the Commission and approach. So, it enables better access of the Commission to persons belonging to these marginalized groups, and in a way it is an extremely critical requirement, and there is a lot more that needs to be done in order to make the National Human Rights Commission truly a plural body. Now, let us look at the lack of enforcement powers. The NHRC does not have the power to enforce its orders, and which are treated as mere recommendations. When NHRC makes a recommendation and if there is a unwillingness on the part of the authorities to accept these recommendations or act upon those recommendations, the Commission is forced to approach the Supreme Court or the High Court for issue of orders and writs in order to secure compliance with its recommendations. It has done it on a few occasions in the past, but this lack of enforcement powers is or it represents a major challenge to the Commission. And the moment everyone knows that it is only a recommendatory body and it does not have power to issue binding orders or writs, one can only imagine what the state of compliance will be. There are a number of operational problems. Insofar as redressal of individual complaints is concerned, a lot of Commission's time goes into taking up these individual complaints. There is a need to shift from complaints-led approach to a policy-led approach. One needs to focus on root reform, branch reform. One needs to look at law and policy reform rather than be obsessed with individual complaints of human rights violations. For instance, you take its NHRC's role with regard to intervention in the court proceedings involving serious human rights issues. The Commission has not really used this power enough. It could have done more, but there seems to be a self-imposed restraint on the Commission in this matter. And there needs to be a greater coordination between the law research division as well as the courts, and NHRC's recommendations extend to only giving the state recommendations. That is why it has been called quite often a toothless tiger in certain quarters, and as it cannot really secure compliance by the authorities. When you look at spreading of the human rights literacy, its efforts have been able to generate some awareness, but it has not been able to achieve the ultimate goal of sensitizing the society about human rights. Besides organizing conferences and seminars, the Commission has to put a lot more effort into publishing of posters, pamphlets in Indian languages, and making documentaries, movies, and also use mass media like radio and TV to create awareness among people across the nook and breadth of this country and including in remote areas. When you look at relationships with the sister organizations, there again there are serious challenges. Today there are over 169 national state human rights institutions working across the country, but the coordination between these institutions is poor. And for instance, the deemed members of the National Human Rights Commission do not participate in the international training programs, and of course all of them need to work in tandem so that to avoid duplication in efforts, for a better coordination, cooperation, and so the cooperation remains an expectation. And when you look at its relationship with the state human rights commissions, NHRC could have transferred a lot of complaints to the State Human Rights Commission, and which have a primary function of complaint redressal, so that NHRC is left to address bigger policy related issues with its limited resources. Now, to sum up, if you really analyze, on the one hand there are a few achievements, on the other hand there have been many justifiable criticisms of the Commission. So, NHRC suffers from a number of weaknesses. Some of them are based in its statute. That is why it has been dubbed as a toothless tiger in certain quarters. But in the past, the Commission has proved that it can be a guardian of people's human rights. And if these difficulties either in its statute or in its powers are removed, the NHRC can again gain the credibility in the eyes of the public. On the whole, if you really examine the Commission and subject it to a critical evaluation, it is a question of a glass being half full or half empty. So, on the one hand there are a few achievements, but then the road to be traversed, the area to be covered is a vast one, and there is a lot more that needs to be done to meet the people's expectations, to meet NGOs' expectations, to meet expectations of the wide cross section of the society regarding protection and promotion of human rights. Thank you.